Sherlock Holmes and Amp. The candle that burned cold the client who came in from the fog. It was upon a bitter January morning, when the breath of London seemed suspended in a pall of grey frost, that Sherlock Holmes roused himself from one of his more contemplative trances, and uttered an exclamation so sudden that I nearly spilled the coffee I had been pouring. The fire in our Baker Street sitting-room sputtered weakly, as though unwilling to challenge the hostile chill pressing against the window panes. Holmes, still framed by the shifting vapors of his pipe, leaned forward with the alert poise of a hound scenting a trail. "Watson," said he, tapping the morning paper with his long, nervous forefinger. "There is a case here, though the reporters have, as ever, smothered its essential features in pompous irrelevance which may, if my instincts prove correct, occupy us before the day is out." I took the newspaper from him, noting as I did so the peculiar glint in his eyes, the same keen brightness I had seen countless times before at the inception of some extraordinary chain of events. Holmes was never more alive than when confronting the mystery of a human crime. The article in question described, in terse yet sensational terms, the discovery of a body in Clerkenwell. A gentleman of some standing, a Mr. Alistair Hargreave, banker and philanthropist, had been found dead at his writing desk late the previous evening. The constable on duty reported no signs of forced entry, nor any indication of robbery. Most strangely of all, a single candle had been left burning beside the corpse, though, as the article made careful note, the flame had gone out long before the body was discovered. The room bore no scorch marks, no trace of a draught, and the candle itself, half melted and innocuous, seemed almost ludicrous in its placement. "The press," Holmes murmured with that faint note of contempt inherent in his tone whenever crime and journalism converged, "would have its readers believe that every mysterious circumstance must conceal some occult menace. Nonsense, Watson. Facts, not phantoms, guide the intellect." "Yet the candle seems a curious detail," I observed. "If it was not lit at the time of discovery, how do they know its relevance?" "Ah, that is precisely the question. For a candle which has burned cold is a contradiction in itself, and contradictions, my dear fellow, are the stepping stones to truth." Before I could request elaboration, the violent clang of our doorbell rang through the chambers, followed by hurried footsteps upon the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's startled exclamation reached us even before the knock sounded upon the sitting-room door. "Come," Holmes called. The door opened to admit a man whose very appearance betrayed a soul battered by dread. He was tall yet stooped, his overcoat dusted with the frost of the morning, and his gloves still clutched tightly in his trembling hands. His face, prematurely lined, bore the unmistakable strain of sleeplessness. His eyes darted, as though expecting some invisible assailant. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he managed, his voice quavering. Holmes rose slightly and gestured to the chair beside the fire. "I am he. And you, sir, appear to be in urgent need of assistance." "My name is Edwin Hargreave," the man said, sinking into the chair.
"Brother to the late Alistair Hargreave."
I exchanged a glance with Holmes. So quickly had the matter presented itself at our door that I felt the small thrill of anticipation which often heralded the unfolding of some intricate affair. "My brother," Mr. Hargreave continued, "was found dead last night, though perhaps you have read of it. The papers are already making a spectacle of it. But I assure you," he leaned forward, gripping his gloves, "it is far worse, far stranger than they know." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Then tell us plainly, Mr. Hargreave, what troubles you beyond the ordinary bereavement?" The man swallowed hard. "Because Alistair did not die of natural causative, that I am convinced. He was a cautious man, a methodical man, yet deeply secretive. These past weeks he seemed troubled, distracted. He confided little, but hinted that he had stumbled upon something dangerous to more than himself." Holmes's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Dangerous? In what sense? I know not. Only that 3 evenings before his death, I visited his home. He appeared unusually tense, and when I approached his study, he closed the door with a force I had never seen from him. Later, when he joined me for supper, he said the most peculiar thing, and that was—" Mr. Hargreave's voice fell to a whisper. He said, "If anything happens to me, Edwin, remember that the flame tells the lie but the cold will speak truth." Holmes sat back, his expression unreadable. "Curious," he murmured.
Very curious indeed.
"That candle?" Mr. Hargreave pressed. "The one found beside him, it must have something to do with his words. My brother was not a man to speak in riddles, and I fear he suspected someone or something." Holmes waved away the ambiguity. "Let us keep our feet firmly planted in rational soil. Mr. Hargreave, you believe your brother was murdered?" "I am certain of it." "And Scotland Yard?" "They believe it an unfortunate collapse brought on by stress." Inspector Jarvis seemed more interested in clearing the matter swiftly than examining the oddities of the room. Holmes's expression grew dry. Jarvis is a man of action, not introspection. He sees only what is placed before him, never what frames the picture. Mr. Hargreave leaned closer. "Will you take the case? Will you examine the room yourself?" Holmes rose without hesitation. "I shall. Watson, your coat. We go at once." As our client exhaled in visible relief, Holmes crossed to the mantel and retrieved his violin case, not to play, but to extract from its lining a slender magnifying lens and a set of instruments he kept for the examination of delicate evidence. It was typical of Holmes to hide the tools of his trade in the least obvious places. Within minutes we descended the stairs. The morning fog clung to the street like a damp shroud, and as we stepped into our waiting hansom cab, I felt the weight of impending events pressing upon my thoughts. Holmes remained silent for several minutes, gazing out at the blurred silhouettes of Londoners passing through the mist. At length he spoke. "Watson, did you note the man's hands? His hands?" "They were trembling, certainly." "Not merely trembling," Holmes replied. "There was a faint trace of ash upon the fingertip sash of a type seldom produced by common hearths. Furthermore, his gloves were worn at the seams of the thumb and forefinger on the right hand, suggesting frequent handling of some small object." "And what do you deduce from that?" I asked. "Nothing yet," he said serenely. "But deduction begins with observation. When facts align, the pattern shall emerge." The cab rattled over the uneven cobblestones, bearing us toward Clerkenwell and the home of the late Alistair Hargreave. Holmes leaned forward, his long frame coiled with anticipation, while I attempted to marshal my own thoughts. The curious phrase, "the flame tells the lie, but the cold will speak truth," echoed in my mind. As we turned onto St. Dunstan Lane, the faint silhouette of the Hargreave residence materialized through the fog. A tall, somber edifice with the drawn curtains of mourning. A constable stood sentinel at the gate, his collar turned against the biting wind. Holmes stepped from the cab with his characteristic briskness. "Come, Watson," he said. "Let us see what secrets a cold candle may hold." And with that, we crossed the threshold into the mystery that would soon embroil us in a web of deception, danger, and a truth colder than any flame that ever dared burn. It was with that peculiar mixture of solemnity and anticipation and emotion I had come to know intimately through my years with Sherlock Holmes that I crossed the threshold of the late Alistair Hargreave's residence. The house, standing austere upon its narrow parcel of Clerkenwell stone, possessed a stillness that set my nerves subtly on edge. Grief leaves a certain residue in the air, perceptible even to the most insensible visitor. Yet here there was something else in absence, a vacancy, as though some essential element had been drawn away. Holmes seemed invigorated rather than subdued by the solemn atmosphere. He cast a brief glance at the constable posted at the door, nodded curtly, and followed our shaken client, Edwin Hargreave, through a dim corridor toward the study where the body had been discovered. "I must warn you," Edwin murmured, pausing before a heavy oak door. "I have not had the courage to enter this room since last night. The police inspected it, of course, but I could not bear to see it again. You must understand, Alistair and I were not merely brothers. We were business partners, companions in our youth, and though our lives diverged, still, the sight of him," his voice broke. Holmes placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Courage, Mr. Hargreave. Truth requites discomfort. and your presence will not be required for long. Watson and I shall examine the scene independently." The man nodded, retreating a step as Holmes pushed open the study door. The room beyond was a rectangular chamber with high shelves crowded by ledgers, journals, and orderly ranks of leather-bound volumes. The drapes, heavy and dark, were drawn half-closed against the weak winter light. A faint smell of mildew mingled with the lingering odor of extinguished wax. And there, at the center of the chamber, stood the writing desk, massive, mahogany, occupying the space with an air of brooding importance. My breath caught slightly. Though the body had been removed, the impression of death remained like a palpable chill. Holmes stepped forward at once, his manner swift yet measured.
"Observe, Watson, nothing has been disturbed."
Inspector Jarvis, for all his haste in drawing conclusions, is at least disciplined in preserving a crime scene. He moved to the desk, his keen gaze sweeping over every surface. "Here," he said, pointing, "is the exact spot where Alistair Hargreave collapsed or was made to collapse." I followed his gesture. A subtle discoloration marred the grain of the polished wood where the deceased's forearm had apparently rested. Near the edge of the desk lay a half-melted candle in a brass holder. The wick, blackened and cool, curled like the tail of some small, lifeless creature. Holmes examined the candle closely, lowering his face until his aquiline nose nearly touched the wax. "Most curious," he whispered.
"What do you see?"
I asked. "Patience, Watson," he murmured. "The room must speak in its own time." He next turned to the chair behind the desk, an upholstered armchair whose left front leg bore a faint scuff upon the carpet as though shifted or jostled. Kneeling, Holmes ran his finger along the depression in the fabric. "Shifted recently," he said. "Very recently. Though not by the deceased himself." I blinked. "How can you be so certain?" Holmes did not reply, but instead moved abruptly toward the fireplace. The hearth lay cold, though a few gray remains suggested a modest fire at some earlier hour. On the mantel stood a small clock, a porcelain vase of dried flowers, and several envelopes arranged in a neat stack. He lifted the top envelope, then replaced it. "What is odd?" "That these letters remain unopened. A man who keeps meticulous journals and letters arranged chronologically would not allow correspondence to sit idle upon his mantel." "You believe he never saw them?" "Precisely, which suggests either that he had no opportunity to read them or that he feared what they contained." He crossed to the tall windows and pushed aside the heavy drapes, allowing a wan stream of daylight to spill into the room. Dust danced in the light like 1,000 tiny spirits. Holmes studied the windowsill carefully. "No marks of intrusion," he said. "No sign of forced tampering from outside. Therefore a visitor must have been admitted." I completed. Holmes only smiled faintly, as though pleased by my modest deduction. He next examined the rug beneath the desk. Kneeling once more, he brushed his fingers across a faint irregularity in the pile. Then, leaning down, he brought his magnifying lens to bear. "Look here, Watson," he said quietly. I peered over his shoulder. Embedded in the fibers, nearly invisible, were two minuscule fragments, one silver-fine, like a sliver of wire, the other a grain of pale crystalline substance. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "Merely that our Mr. Hargreave entertained a guest whose presence he either anticipated keenly or dreaded profoundly." I was about to inquire further when Holmes rose suddenly and strode to the bookshelf closest to the desk. He scanned the titles with quick, precise movements, plucking one volume from the shelf, a ledger bound in green leather. "This," he said, "ought not to be here." He flipped it open. The page was blank. "Empty," I said. "Entirely. And yet it is placed among volumes filled with accounts meticulously documented over years. Someone inserted it or removed something else." He replaced the width of the room twice, hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed in thought. "Holmes," I said gently, "what are you forming in that mind of yours?" "That which, for the moment, must remain unspoken. The room is rich in suggestion, Watson, but suggestion is not yet proof." He turned abruptly toward the door.
Mr.
Hargreave must answer several questions. We rejoined Edwin Hargreave in the corridor, where he stood twisting his gloves with nervous agitation. "Your brother," Holmes began without preamble, "was a man of routine, I gather." "Very much so. He kept records of every transaction, every engagement, even his private reflections." "Then tell me," Holmes said, "did he customarily meet with clients or associates here?" "In his home? Only rarely. Perhaps once every 2 months. He preferred to conduct his affairs at the bank." "And of late? Has he received visitors at unusual hours?" Edwin hesitated. "There was one man. I encountered him leaving the house a week ago late in the evening." Holmes leaned forward. "Describe him." "A dark-haired man of middle height." I did not see his face clearly. My brother simply said he was an advisor of sorts and declined to elaborate. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "And the candle?" he asked. "Did your brother use it for reading, or did he hold some symbolic attachment to candlelight?" "No," Edwin replied, bewildered. Alistair was practical. He used gaslight like any sensible gentleman. Holmes nodded slowly. "That will be all for now." We stepped out into the bleak morning once more. The fog had thickened, blurring the outlines of the street until buildings seemed like vague silhouettes of themselves. Holmes halted abruptly on the pavement, his gaze fixed upon the Hargreave house. "Watson," he said in a low voice, "we tread upon dangerous soil. There is something in that room, something subtle yet deeply wrong. The candle is but one thread. Pull it, and the tapestry may unravel. You believe this is no mere domestic tragedy?" Holmes gave a rare, grim smile. "My dear fellow, we have only just opened the door. The true contours of the matter lie ahead, and I fear they may cast longer shadows than our client imagines." He stepped into the waiting cab, gesturing for me to follow. "The game, Watson," he said softly as the driver cracked his whip, "is not merely afoot. It is beginning in earnest." The cab bore us away from Clerkenwell at a brisk pace, the wheels slicing through the slush that clung stubbornly to the gutters. Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent, his long frame folded into a posture of austere contemplation. I have often remarked upon his ability to retreat from the external world while sitting directly within it. His eyes fixed upon some point neither seen nor known, his thoughts racing far ahead of the present moment. More than once I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again, reluctant to disrupt the delicate machinery in motion within his mind. At last, however, curiosity overcame restraint. "You observed something in that study," I ventured. "Something you have not yet revealed." Holmes's eyes flickered toward me, then back to the fogged window. "I observed many things, Watson, several of which contradict the official account, and at least one of which contradicts itself." I frowned. "Contradicts itself? Yes. A paradox, a self-negating proposition much like our cold candle." He tapped his fingers lightly on his knee. "And paradoxes, as you well know, are invitations." "To what, precisely?" "To look beyond what is shown." The cab turned sharply onto Oxford Street, scattering a group of errand boys who shouted curses at our driver. The fog had thickened into a clammy frost, settling upon London like a damp cloak. Holmes watched it, his face sharpened by the milky light. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "what struck you as most unusual in that room?" I considered. "The candle, certainly. The strange phrase Alistair Hargreave spoke to his brother. The unopened letters. The empty ledger. All notable," Holmes said, nodding slightly, "but incomplete." "Then what did I miss?" "Two things," he replied. "One, exceedingly simple. The other exceedingly subtle." He said no more, and I had learned enough not to press him. The cab rattled toward Baker Street, and by the time we arrived the frost had woven a delicate crust over the railings and gas lamps. We ascended the 17 steps to our familiar sitting room, where Holmes immediately threw himself into his armchair and lit his pipe with a violent energy that betrayed the intensity of his inner agitation. I busied myself with preparing tea, though the chill in my fingers suggested that the kettle would take its time in boiling. Holmes watched me for a moment with half-lidded eyes. "You are troubled, Watson." "Not troubled," I replied, "but perplexed. You have often shared your observations with me more readily. Yet today you seem curiously reserved." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Not reserved, merely prudent. If I speak prematurely, I risk narrowing our inquiry. Better, for the moment, to keep all possibilities unfettered." He leaned forward. "Still, I shall give you one morsel." I set down the teapot. Holmes withdrew from his pocket a small paper twist. Untwisting it, he revealed the crystalline fragment he had collected from the Hargreave carpet. "This," he said, "is no common salt, nor sugar,
Nor residue of household origin.
It is a compound used in certain industrial processes seldom associated with the domestic study of a banker." "What does that imply? That someone entered that room bearing a substance they had no reason to carry, and that substance may lead us to the truth." I examined the tiny crystal, which sparkled faintly in the lamplight. "Industrial, you say? Perhaps from the workshops that line Clerkenwell Road?" "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Or perhaps from far more select premises." Before I could ask further, a knock sounded at the door. Holmes stiffened, then rose. "We expect no callers." Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up.
"A visitor for you, gentlemen."
Holmes shot me a glance, a sharp, wordless communication, then stepped to open the sitting-room door. A young woman entered. She was tall, pale, and clad in garments of mourning, though her composure did not carry the disarray of fresh grief. Her expression was one of determined control. Her eyes moved swiftly, taking in Holmes, myself, and every corner of the room in a single sweep. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, her voice low and steady, "I beg your pardon for calling unannounced, but I believe you are investigating the death of Mr. Alistair Hargreave." Holmes bowed slightly. "That is correct, madam." "And you are Miss Diana Hargreave," she replied, "the daughter of your client's late brother." I confess I stared. Edwin Hargreave had given no indication he possessed a niece, much less one who carried herself with such poise. Holmes resumed his seat, steepling his fingers. "Pray be seated. Your arrival is most timely." Miss Hargreave declined the proffered chair.
"No, thank you."
"I shall not remain long." There was something keen in her tone, and urgency sharpened by fear. Holmes noted it instantly. "You have come with information?" "Yes." Her gloved hands tightened around a small parcel she carried. "Information and a warning." Holmes smiled faintly. "Those are always welcome." She drew a breath. "My father was not the man my uncle imagines him to be, nor was his death the accident the police claim. I believe he was being watched, followed, harassed by a man he feared greatly." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Describe this man." "I cannot. I never saw him. But my father spoke of him in veiled terms. He said the man possessed a mind like ice and motives darker than a shuttered cellar. My father grew more anxious in recent weeks. He sealed documents, burned others, and insisted upon locking his study even when stepping out for a moment." Holmes's eyes glinted. "And the parcel you carry?" "A key," she said, unwrapping the cloth. "To a lockbox my father kept at the bank, the contents of which he forbade anyone to view except under the gravest circumstances. Those circumstances have now arrived." She placed the key on Holmes's table. It gleamed softly in the firelight, an ornate silver instrument marked by an unusual triangular groove. Holmes examined it carefully. "Did your uncle send you with this?" "No," Miss Hargreave said firmly. "He knows nothing of it. My father entrusted me with the key alone, and I fear my uncle's intentions. He is not the man he pretends." She stopped abruptly, her eyes darting toward the window. Holmes rose in a single fluid motion. "Watson." I crossed to the window. The fog had thickened, pressed against the glass in pale smears. But through it I discerned the shadow of a figure standing in the street below, motionless, indistinct, half swallowed by the frost. A watcher, I murmured. Holmes joined me, peering down with keen intensity. No ordinary passerby lingers in such a manner. When we turned back, Miss Hargreaves' composure had stiffened further. "You see now," she said hoarsely. "He is not merely watching me, he is watching everyone connected to my father." Holmes returned to his seat, though I could detect the tension in the lines of his posture. "You have done wisely to come," he said. "Leave the key with me. You will be under my protection now." But Miss Hargreaves shook her head. "No, I shall remain in hiding, as my father advised. I have told you what I know. The rest lies in your hands." She gathered her cloak about her and turned toward the door. "And Mr. Holmes, beware the candle. My father said it once before he died. The flame shows what you expect. The cold shows what is real." Holmes did not stand to see her out. His gaze had shifted inward, locked on some deep calculation. When the door closed behind her, I exhaled heavily. "Holmes, this grows more tangled by the moment." He gave a soft, dangerous laugh. "My dear Watson, this is no longer a tangle. It is a web one spun long before we arrived. And the spider, I suspect, is watching even now." The man beneath the lamp, it was some minutes after Miss Diana Hargreaves' departure before either of us spoke. The silence in our sitting room was unusually taut, humming like a violin string drawn too tightly across its bridge. Holmes stood at the window, hands clasped behind him, his eyes fixed not on the street, but on some invisible point far beyond it. The fog pressed in against the glass like a living vapor. Lamplight from Baker Street flickered dimly, its halo failing to pierce more than a few feet of gray. Somewhere a carriage clattered past, muffled, distant, and in the stillness between those sounds, I sensed Holmes's mind whirring with a feverish speed. At last, he spoke without turning. "Watson, did you obtain a clear view of the watcher?" "Only the shape of him," I admitted. "A man of medium height, wrapped in a coat. Too vague to distinguish." Holmes nodded, though the gesture seemed addressed more to himself than to me. "Vague shapes in fog are often deliberate," he murmured. "A man who wishes not to be observed may choose the fog as his accomplice." He turned from the window abruptly and sat, though the restlessness in his limbs was unmistakable. He seized his pipe, then put it down again. For a moment he merely stared at the silver key Miss Hargreaves had entrusted to us. "Holmes," I ventured, "you believe she is in danger?" He exhaled sharply. "Watson, she has been in danger for far longer than she knows. That watcher below may be a threat or he may be a warning. But he is no idle pedestrian." I took a step closer. "And the key?" Holmes extended a long, thin finger toward it. "This key, my dear fellow, may open far more than a lockbox. It may unlock the motive behind Alistair Hargreaves' death." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson appeared, flustered and pale. "Mr. Holmes, sir?" "A gentleman insists upon seeing you. I told him you were engaged, but he would not be dismissed." Holmes shot me a quick glance. "Our watcher?" "Perhaps," I said. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes ordered. A moment later the door swung wide and in stepped a man whose presence altered the very temperature of the room. He was slender, impeccably dressed in a dark overcoat of excellent cut. His hair was neatly parted, his mustache trimmed with military precision. Yet it was his eyes, cold, alert, faintly mocking, that arrested immediate attention. They swept over Holmes, then myself, and finally the silver key, lingering there with unmistakable recognition. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said with a slight bow. His voice was smooth, cultured, but with a metallic undertone that hinted at something less civilized beneath. "And Dr. Watson, forgive the intrusion." Holmes reclined in his chair with deceptive indolence. "I rarely forgive an intrusion," he said coolly. "But I tolerate one if the intruder proves interesting. State your name and your business." "My name," the man replied, removing his gloves, "is Adrian Lockwood." Holmes's brows lifted by a fraction. "Lockwood? Of the Lockwood Foundry Consortium?" "The same," Lockwood answered with a cold smile. though I am here in a private capacity." Holmes did not invite him to sit. Lockwood sat anyway. "Then state your private purpose," Holmes said.
Your posture suggests urgency. Your manner suggests caution.
"And your eyes," he gestured, "subtly suggest that you did not come here to seek my help but to judge the extent of what I already know." Lockwood's smile faltered a small, telling crack in an otherwise impenetrable facade. "You are perceptive, Mr. Holmes. I make a modest effort." Lockwood's gaze hardened. "Then let us speak plainly. I am aware that you visited Alistair Hargreaves' home this morning. I am also aware that his daughter has approached you." The air tightened. Holmes neither blinked nor moved. "You seem remarkably well informed for a man not associated with the family." "I was a business associate of the late Mr. Hargreave." "A vague term," Holmes said. "Let us have a clearer one." Lockwood leaned forward. "I am here to advise you firmly that pursuing this matter will bring you more trouble than benefit. Let the police handle it, cop the case." "And if I do not?" Holmes asked softly. Lockwood's eyes flashed with something between threat and disdain. "Then," he said, "you will find yourself entangled in matters far beyond criminal inquiry, matters of interest to individuals who do not take kindly to interference." Holmes folded his hands. "Is that a threat?" "An observation." Holmes's tone turned icy. "You choose your words like a man accustomed to being obeyed." "And you choose yours like a man unaccustomed to fear," Lockwood replied. The room seemed to contract. I could feel my pulse in my wrists. At last, Lockwood rose. "My counsel stands. Disengage from this case. It is not your concern." Holmes smiled dangerously. "You have a curious notion of what is, or is not, my concern." Lockwood paused at the door. Mr. Holmes," he said without turning, "the candle was not meant for you." And with that enigmatic remark, he departed. The door shut with a soft click. I exhaled sharply. "Holmes, what the devil did he mean by that?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He stood, paced twice, then stopped abruptly before the fireplace. "Watson," he said, "we are dealing with a man of considerable power, influence, wealth, and a temperament that delights in veiled menace. Do you know him?" Holmes paused. "I know of him. Lockwood has a reputation in certain circles rarely spoken of in polite society. A man with laboratories, hidden behind factories. A man whose name appears in financial ledgers that never see daylight. A man who deals not merely in goods, but in secrets." A chill crept up my spine. "And you believe he is connected to Hargreaves' death?" Holmes turned sharply. "I believe he is orbiting it. Whether as predator, scavenger, or protector remains to be seen." He tapped his finger against the mantel. "We must verify the contents of Hargreaves' lockbox at the bank. When? Before the day ends." He took his coat. "But first we must pay a visit to Inspector Jarvis." "For what reason?" Holmes's lips curled into a thin line. "Because Jarvis is about to arrest the wrong man." I stopped in my tracks.
"What man?"
Holmes opened the door, gesturing for me to follow.
"The one who will seem most obvious," he said.
"The brother. Edwin Hargreave. Arrest him. But why? On what grounds?" Holmes shook his head. "On the grounds that are always used when a case is more complicated than a policeman wishes. Opportunity, proximity, and a convenient motive. Jarvis will see Edwin's grief as guilt, his confusion as evasion. You believe Edwin innocent?" Holmes paused at the landing. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is innocence, and there is irrelevance. Edwin Hargreave may be many things, but he did not engineer his brother's death." The street outside was still cloaked in frost. Holmes hailed a cab, and as we climbed inside, he leaned forward and spoke in a far lower voice than usual. "Remember this, Watson." Lockwood said one thing which reveals his entire purpose. "The candle?" Holmes's eyes glinted like steel.
"No."
He said the candle was not meant for me, meaning he knows who it was meant for. "And who is that?" Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, their clarity almost frightening. "That, my dear Watson, we must discover before our enemy discovers us." The cab lurched forward. We were no longer chasing a mystery. A mystery was now chasing us. The incongruous mark. It was not until the following morning that the full strangeness of Holmes's behavior the previous night settled upon my mind. I awoke to find Baker Street unusually silent, as though the very air held its breath. A gray, reluctant dawn seeped thinly through the curtains, scattering weak light upon the armchair Holmes had occupied hours before. Its cushions still indented as if it retained his very shape. Of the man himself there was no sign. Mrs. Hudson, her hands floured from morning preparations, met me on the staircase with a worried frown. "Mr. Holmes went out at 5:30, doctor," she said. "He left no message, only asked that breakfast be kept warm for you." This, of course, was no remarkable occurrence in itself. Holmes often kept irregular hours, but I sensed a tension in the flat which mirrored my own unease. There had been something deeply troubling in the way he had stared into the candle's cold flame at the Carmichael residence, as though listening to a voice only he could hear. I was sipping my second cup of tea and contemplating whether to follow after him when the door swung open and Holmes strode in, his coat damp with dew and his eyes alight with that peculiar gleam which heralded, in my experience, either revelation or impending catastrophe.
"Good morning, Watson. You have not breakfasted without me, I trust."
"I waited," said I. "You were gone quite earlier than even the sun cared to rise," he said, tossing his gloves into the chair. "But productive, Watson. Remarkably productive." He lowered himself into the seat opposite mine, steepling his fingers. Despite his casual posture, I detected the restrained excitement beneath it. "You are ready for the day's exertions?" "Entirely so. Have you made progress, my dear fellow?" he said, reaching for the teapot. "I have confirmed that the case is not what it claims to be." "And what does it claim to be? A murder in a sealed room," he said lightly, which is always a bore, since so many assume the impossible. "But we deal, as always, in the eminently possible. It is the improbable that must be coaxed into daylight." I was about to inquire further when a knock at the door interrupted us. Moments later, Inspector Lestrade entered, looking as though he had been dragged backward through a chimney. "Holmes," he barked without preamble, "there's been another incident." Holmes looked up sharply. "At the Carmichael house?" "No. Worse. A break-in at the late Mr. Harrington's chemist shop in Lambeth. Someone smashed their way in during the night, and the only things missing are bottles of phosphorus and several vials of ether." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Phosphorus," he murmured. "A curious selection." "I don't see what's curious about it," Lestrade huffed. "Chemicals go missing, that's all. But given the casino, no," said Holmes, rising abruptly. "The thief's choice tells us everything." "Watson, your hat. Lestrade with us." Every minute wasted only deepens the intruder's advantage. We were soon rattling through the morning streets in a hansom cab. London was stirring awake, carts clattering and errand boys shouting through the fog. Lestrade, jostling between us, looked sour. "I suppose you already have some theory," he muttered. Holmes gave the faintest smile. "I have something better. An observation. A single fact out of place that unmakes the entire tableau presented to us yesterday." "And what fact is that?" I asked. Holmes waved the question away. "Patience, Watson. If I tell you now, I rob you of the pleasure of discovering it." We reached Harrington's chemist shortly after 7. It was a narrow shop on a street of butchers and bakeries, its windows bright but its inside shrouded in disarray. A constable stood watch at the door, saluting Lestrade as we entered. Broken glass crunched underfoot. Shelves had been disturbed, jars overturned, and a faint chemical tang hung heavy in the air. Holmes surveyed the destruction without expression, his gaze moving rapidly from splintered wood to scattered powders. "Only phosphorus and ether?" he asked. "Aye," said the constable. "Didn't take coins from the till nor touch anything else." Holmes crouched near the counter, examining a faint smear upon the floorboards.
What's in your medical eye?
I knelt beside him. It was a thin, blackish streak, barely discernible. Burn residue, I said. From a treated match, perhaps. And see here and here finger smudges where someone attempted to shield a flame from the wind. Just so, murmured Holmes. Lestrade, see to what degree this residue matches the candle stub found near Carmichael's body. Lestrade blinked. But how what?
Holmes rose smoothly.
Because, my dear Inspector, the crimes are linked not by motive but by method, and that makes them infinitely more fascinating. He moved to the back door, where the lock had been crudely forced. This was no professional act, he said. The intruder was in haste. There is something else. He touched the edge of the broken wood, then lifted his fingertips for my view. A faint metallic shimmer clung to them. Silver nitrate, I said at once. Precisely. And why would a thief rushing through a break-in acquire silver nitrate on his gloves? Unless he had recently been handling something treated with it, an object meant to capture or reflect light. Lestrade looked utterly puzzled. Holmes straightened, brushing off his coat. I have seen enough. The thief took nothing of monetary value, only tools. Phosphorus, to conceal or illuminate ether, to stupefy or ignite. We are dealing with someone staging illusions in the dark, Lestrade. Someone who understands the chemistry of deception.
And does that point us to a suspect?
Lestrade demanded. On the contrary, said Holmes coolly. It eliminates the suspect you favor. Lestrade reddened. You mean Carmichael's nephew? Holmes nodded. A young man of intemperate habits, yes, but entirely lacking in the scientific knowledge required for this endeavor. No, the true culprit is older, more patient, more theatrical. He paused, his gaze drifting to the shattered window, through which the morning fog mingled with lingering vapors. Watson, he said softly, do you recall the drawing room at the Carmichael house? Specifically, the mark upon the mantel. I frowned, searching my memory. The small crescent-shaped stain? Exactly. You saw it, but you did not observe it. That mark, gentlemen, tells us the identity of the person who stood nearest to the deceased in his final moments. I was astounded. But how can a mere stain reveal that? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Because it is no ordinary stain. But I shall not repeat myself in a dusty chemist shop. Let us return to Baker Street. I must illustrate the point with accuracy.
We arrived home shortly after 9.
Holmes wasted no time. He extracted from his drawer a fresh candle, one of those unusually composed varieties that burns with a bluish flame.
You recall, Watson, that the candle at the scene had burned cold?
Yes, it produced light, yet no warmth. Exactly. A contradiction that reveals purpose rather than happenstance. Lestrade looked between us. Cold or warm, a candle's a candle. Holmes gave him a sympathetic glance. A natural error, Inspector. But a fatal one when dealing with a murder staged to mimic impossibility. The candle was coated with a substance that alters its temperature while preserving the flame. And more importantly, he tapped the candle's base. It leaves deposits. Deposits identical to the crescent-shaped stain upon the Carmichael mantel. I leaned forward. Holmes, are you saying the killer leaned the candle there? Not just leaned it, Holmes said. They rested it in a position of waiting, which tells us they needed darkness for a crucial moment. Darkness that was not natural, but engineered. Lestrade threw up his hands.
You're talking riddles, Holmes.
Holmes smiled faintly. Then allow me to speak plainly. The mark on the mantel tells us the killer stood near enough to set the candle aside while committing the act, and that stain, Watson, could only have come from a particular formula used by one type of person in London. And who is that? I asked. A maker of optical illusions, Holmes said softly. A lanternist. One who paints shadows upon walls. I stared at him, astonished. Holmes folded his hands. The killer, Watson, is a man who understands the chemistry of artificial light better than any chemist alive. He paused. and I fear he has not yet finished his performance. A shadow in Lambeth. I have often remarked, in my chronicles of our association, that there were times when Holmes appeared less a man of flesh and blood than some austere instrument devised solely for the purpose of untangling human wickedness. That morning, as he stood before the window with the pale daylight falling upon his sharp profile, I felt again that peculiar awe which he inspired in me from the very first case we undertook together. For a long moment after his declaration, neither Lestrade nor I spoke. The notion that our murderer might be some manner of lanternistic conjurer of shadows hung between us, with unsettling weight. Lestrade was the first to break the silence. "A lanternist," he repeated skeptically. "Those music-hall fellows who frighten children with painted devils on bed-sheets? You can't be serious." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I am never more serious than when you believe me least so." He turned from the window. "The tradition you refer to is but a crude offshoot of a much older and more subtle art. There are men in this city who command illusions as skillfully as a composer commands notes. They can shape darkness, Watson, as a sculptor shapes clay." "Granted," Lestrade growled. "But to what end? Why would a lanternist wish to kill an old gentleman in his study?" "That," said Holmes, "is the question we must answer before nightfall." He strode across the room, seized his violin, and drew the bow across the strings with a sudden, urgent stroke. A discordant note vibrated through the air, sharp, electric, and profoundly unsettling. Holmes often played when wrestling with a stubborn line of thought, but there was agitation in his movements I had seldom witnessed. "Holmes," I ventured gently, "this case troubles you in a manner quite unlike others." He lowered the bow. "Because, my dear Watson, our culprit seeks not merely to kill, but to manipulate perception itself to command a narrative. Such a man is dangerous beyond measure. He does not simply obscure the truth, he rewrites it." Lestrade stared at him. "And how do you propose we find this shadow painter?" Holmes set the violin aside and reached for his coat, by observing the only clue he failed to disguise. "And that is the cold candle," Holmes replied. "Or, more precisely, the chemical formula that makes such a thing possible. There are but 3 places in London where an individual may acquire the compound in its purest form, and only one of them lies within reasonable distance of both the Carmichael residence and Harrington's chemist." He paused before the door. "Watson, Lestrade, gentlemen, our destination is Lambeth." It was nearing 11:30 when our cab rattled into the narrow, soot-blackened streets of Lambeth. Here, the fog seemed to settle lower, clinging to the cobbles like damp wool. The shops were humble. Tallow merchants, cutlers, instrument repairers, and the occasional magic lantern dealer catering to the music-hall entertainers who prowled the district by night. Holmes directed our driver to a dingy storefront whose windows were clouded by dust and age. Above it hung a faded wooden sign etched with Gothic script, "J. Penworth and Amp Sons Optical and Phantasmagoric Apparatus." Lestrade scowled. "What?" "A term from the late 18th century, Holmes murmured. "An entertainment based upon projecting images through smoke or vapor, a forerunner to certain modern devices." He rapped smartly on the door. It opened a moment later to reveal a stooped, white-haired man with spectacles thick enough to distort his eyes into pale moons. His clothing was neat but worn, as though tended with care long after its prime. "Mr. Penworth?" Holmes asked. "The never expected." "The same," the old man croaked. Holmes presented his card. "Sherlock Holmes. I wish to inquire about a particular compound used for treating candle wax, specifically one that produces a cool flame." Penworth's cloudy eyes gleamed faintly. "A rare request. Most who dabble in such arts burn their fingers before learning caution. My acquaintance," Holmes said with a faint smile, "is not of the burning sort." Penworth stepped aside. "Enter, then. But mind where you walk. The shadows here have minds of their own." The shop's interior was an organized chaos of brass lenses, glass slides, coils of wire, and grotesque painted images stacked in precarious towers. Lantern housing, some no larger than a man's fist, Others the size of kettles hung from the ceiling like strange mechanical bats. Holmes's gaze traveled the room with swift, hungry precision. "You work alone?" he asked. "My sons are gone," Penworth murmured. "One to sea, one to illness. I remain. The trade is not what it was." Holmes nodded sympathetically.
Mr.
"Penworth, I require the names of any clients to whom you have sold cold-burning candle compounds within the past 3 months."
Penworth stiffened.
"I do not discuss my customers." Lestrade stepped forward, flashing his badge. "You will discuss them with Scotland Yard." The old man's wrinkled throat bobbed nervously. Holmes raised a hand. Gently, Lestrade. "Mr. Penworth, a man has been murdered. Another crime has followed. We believe someone has used your materials in their design." Penworth sagged into a wooden chair, hands trembling. "I feared as much," he whispered.
"I feared it the moment I heard the news."
Holmes's eyes narrowed.
"Then you know who is responsible."
Penworth swallowed.
"I sold the compound to only one man.
A gentleman, finely dressed, soft-spoken. He said he needed it for a demonstration and exhibition of scientific curiosities. His name?" Holmes asked sharply. "He gave none," Penworth replied. "But he paid in sovereigns and knew more about optical chemistry than any customer I've met in 20 years. He purchased not only the cooling compound but lantern slides, vapor lenses, and a dissolving view apparatus." Holmes drew a deep, measured breath. "Describe him." "Tall, pale, polite. His gloves were stained with silver nitrate, an occupational hazard for men who handle developing plates." And Penworth hesitated.
"Yes?" Holmes demanded.
"He possessed a most unusual feature. One eye was gray, the other blue." Lestrade muttered something under his breath.
Holmes, however, froze.
For a heartbeat, his stillness was absolute. "Watson," he said slowly, "do you recall the portrait in Carmichael's study? The one hanging nearest the window?"
I nodded.
"The painting of the two brothers, one with mismatched eyes." Holmes turned sharply to Penworth. "Did the gentleman favor his left hand or his right?" "The left," Penworth said.
"He signed for the delivery as such."
Holmes exhaled. "Then it is confirmed." "Holmes," I said, my voice low, "you believe the culprit is yes, Watson." His voice was dark, heavy with certainty. "Our murderer is Harold Carmichael, the late Lord Carmichael's estranged brother." Lestrade was thunderstruck. "But he's been presumed dead for years." "Presumed," Holmes said coldly. "But not confirmed. And now he has returned with skills honed in the shadows and a vendetta as cold as the candle he used." Penworth looked near tears. "Had I suspected, I would never have you are not to blame, sir," Holmes said, placing a hand on the old man's shoulder. "A man bent on deception will find the tools he requires one way or another." Holmes turned to us, his face set with iron resolve. "Lestrade, Watson, we must return to Baker Street. The trap I feared has been sprung. And if I am correct—" He paused, eyes drifting to the darkened corners of Penworth's shop. "Harold Carmichael is not finished. The next act of his phantasmagoria is already underway. The second vanishing it was close upon 1 o'clock when we returned to Baker Street, the sky darkening under a mass of heavy cloud that promised rain before nightfall." Holmes was unusually silent during the hansom ride. His gaze fixed not upon the passing streets but upon some internal configuration of thought known only to himself. More than once he pressed his fingertips together with abrupt precision, as though aligning an invisible diagram. Lestrade, meanwhile, shifted restlessly beside me. "You're quite sure about this, Holmes?" he asked for the 3rd time.
"Harold Carmichael?"
"A man believed dead since '89? "Belief, Inspector," Holmes murmured, "is a most unreliable companion. The newspapers merely accepted what they were told. That Harold drowned during an expedition off Kent, but the body was never recovered. A convenient tragedy for a man wishing to erase himself from society, and to re-enter as what?" Lestrade scoffed. "Some lantern juggler with chemicals and stage tricks." Holmes's sharp profile remained impassive. Not a juggler, Lestrade a master of illusion. A man capable of manipulating perception so thoroughly that even the police would question their own eyes. Lestrade grunted, unconvinced. Holmes leaned forward, his voice low and precise. Harold Carmichael spent the last years of his life, before his disappearance, dabbling in optical sciences. He corresponded with several controversial theorists, men obsessed with the engineering of visual deception. He traveled widely in Europe. He was rumored to have joined a troupe of phantasmagoria artists in Leipzig. His mind, Inspector, was not merely creative, it was obsessive. And obsession, when wedded to bitterness, he allowed the unfinished sentence to hang in the air.
Lestrade fell silent.
So did I.
We stepped into our sitting room at Baker Street only to be struck by an immediate impression that something was amiss. At first, it was only a faint shift in the air, a disturbance in the dust motes drifting across the window. Then Holmes hissed sharply, "Do not touch anything."
I froze.
Lestrade stiffened. Holmes crossed to his writing table in 3 swift strides. There, lying atop a stack of correspondence, was a single folded card. He did not lift it. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe the edges of that card." I bent closer. The paper bore a faint granular shimmer.
"Silver nitrate," I said with certainty.
"Precisely." Holmes turned away from the table as though the card were a venomous serpent. "It has been handled by a man accustomed to photographic chemicals and likely intended to leave a trace." "A message from Harold?"
I asked.
"A message, certainly, but not one we shall handle with bare fingers." He fetched a pair of tongs from a drawer. Holmes was prepared for every eventuality and delicately lifted the card. It opened with a whispering crackle. He held it out for us to see. The message was written in a neat, elegant hand. "Mr. Holmes, your interference amuses me. As a gesture of goodwill, I return to you something you misplaced. Do come find me before it is too late. H." Clipped to the card was a thin strip of dark fabric. I felt an immediate chill.
"Holmes, is that?"
"Yes," he said. "A strip of Mrs. Carmichael's dressing gown." Lestrade's eyes widened. "Good Lord. Then the widow has been taken," Holmes concluded gravely. He set the card down with the tongs and strode to the fireplace.
Then he froze, crouched, and examined the hearth tiles.
"Holmes, what is it?" I asked. "A mark," he said. "Faint. Almost invisible were it not for the angle of the light." I knelt beside him. Indeed, a small crescent-shaped stain, darker than soot yet lighter than ash-marred one tile. The same stain we had observed on the Carmichael mantel. "He was here," Holmes whispered. "He moved through this room while we were away." Lestrade swore softly. I felt a pricking unease crawl along my spine. The very idea that the murderer had walked freely through our sanctuary, our refuge, was as intimate a violation as a knife held to the throat. Holmes rose to his full height. "We have been invited to pursue him," he said. A theatrical flourish entirely in keeping with the man's temperament. "Where do we begin?" I asked. Holmes paced once, twice, then halted abruptly. "Harold Carmichael is staging a performance, and every performance requires a venue. We must ask ourselves, where in London could he orchestrate illusions without interference? Where could he hide a captive and design the second act of his scheme? At his old residence?" Lestrade ventured. Holmes shook his head. "Too obvious. Harold's genius lies in misdirection. He would choose a locale that seems irrelevant, abandoned, or one connected to his craft. A theater?" I suggested. Holmes gave me a rare approving nod. "Closer, Watson. Think smaller, more intimate. A place where shadows can be sculpted at will." I thought. "A magic lantern hall." "Better," he said. "But I have something more precise in mind." He turned sharply to the bookshelf and retrieved a thick city registry. "Harold would require space, privacy, and a structure conducive to manipulation of light. Few buildings in London satisfy those criteria. He flipped through the pages with rapid precision, scanning columns with barely a glance. "Watson, do you recall the dissolving view apparatus Penworth mentioned?" "Yes, such devices require significant depth of field, at least 15 feet of unobstructed projection space, which narrows our possibilities considerably." His finger paused mid-page. He closed the book with a decisive snap. "Gentleman, Harold Carmichael has an ideal refuge, the disused Magdalen Street glasshouse in Southwark, abandoned for years. High ceilings, intact furnace chambers, and long projection corridors once used to test optical glass." Lestrade blinked. "You're certain?" Holmes fixed him with a piercing gaze. "As certain as I am of the direction a candle flame leans in a draught." Lestrade grabbed his coat. "Then let's be off before that lunatic does something irreversible." Holmes did not move. "There is more," he said gravely. "The card speaks of returning something we misplaced." He turned to me. "Watson, what did Harold return?" I frowned. "The cloth strip?" Holmes shook his head. "Not merely cloth. He returns to us the error we made." "I don't understand." "You will," he said, "when you see the glass house." His voice softened, but his eyes were cold as winter steel. "Harold Carmichael has engineered a second vanishing one designed to mimic the death of his brother, yet improved with the cruel ingenuity of a man who has perfected the art of disappearance." He moved with sudden urgency. "Lestrade, summon a police wagon. Watson, arm yourself. The next hour may prove decisive." Lestrade hurried out. Holmes placed a hand on my shoulder. "Be prepared, my dear friend. We are no longer pursuing a murderer." His voice dropped to a whisper. "We are pursuing an artisan. The art he practices is terror itself." The night the trenches listened, the rain came first thin. Cold needles drifting over no man's land, the kind of rain that found every loose seam in a soldier's coat. By midnight, the front was silent except for the quiet dripping of water from duckboards and the distant rumble of artillery far down the line. British sentries leaned over the parapet, listening. German sentries did the same. Both sides waited, breath held, because rumor had spread through every dugout. Tonight something will happen. Nobody knew what. Nobody wanted to guess. The sound beneath the ground for days. Engineers had reported strange tremors under the trenches, vibrations that felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. At first the officers brushed it off as nerves. Then the tremors came again. Longer. Deeper. Corporal Hayes pressed his ear to the mud wall. "That's not thunder. That's digging." The miners were at work. Somewhere below, German tunneling teams were carving their way through the soil, pushing ever closer to the British lines with picks, shovels, and silent sweat. Their goal was simple: plant a mine, blow the trench sky high, erase an entire company in a single heartbeat. Listening posts the British countered with their own secret weapon, not explosives, but ears. Men called listeners were lowered into narrow shafts, where they sat in absolute darkness with nothing but a stethoscope against the earth. Hours passed. Days even. Tonight, Private Mullen heard it. Scratch, crack, scrape. He panicked and yanked the rope. "Pulled up, covered in clay," he gasped. "They're close. Very close. They'll fire the mine before dawn." A decision in the dark. Captain Barker paced inside his dugout, lamp trembling in his hand. If the Germans exploded the mine, the entire sector would vanish: men, guns, sandbags, everything. He had two choices: evacuate the trench and risk the enemy knowing the British were aware, or hold the line and risk losing every one of his men. He chose a third option, the dangerous middle. We thin the line, not abandon it. Skeleton crew only, quietly. In the darkness, men moved like ghosts, slipping back through communication trenches, leaving only a handful of volunteers behind. Hayes stayed. So did Mullen. "If this is the night I go," Hayes muttered, "then I'd rather face it awake." The ground holds its breath. At 3:42 a.m., the tremors stopped. Total silence. Even the rain seemed to pause. Every man remaining in the trench froze, hands tightening around rifles. Somewhere far beneath their boots, German engineers lit long fuses with trembling hands and crawled back through the tunnel in darkness. The British waited. 1 second, 2, 5, 10. Nothing. No explosion. Just silence. The unexpected counterstrike, suddenly a distant boom. Not from below, but from the west. British tunneling teams had detonated their countermine first. The earth rose like a black wave. Soil erupted into the night sky. A roar swallowed the trenches. The German tunnel collapsed with hundreds of tons of mud, crushing everything inside. The mine that was meant to kill the British never fired. It died in the darkness with the men who built it. Aftermath in the rain as dawn slowly peeled back the night. Hayes looked across the ruined landscape. The ground steamed. Crater lips glowed orange. Chunks of timber and equipment were scattered like broken teeth. But the trench still stood. Mullen exhaled for the first time in hours. We survived the night. Hayes nodded, wiping mud from his face. But the war's not done listening. When the gas rolled in the morning after the mine duel felt strangely calm. Too calm. Mist hovered low over no man's land, curling around shattered trees and broken helmets. Birds dared a few uncertain chirps, as if testing whether the world was safe again. But the veterans knew better. Calm never lasted long on the Western Front. The whispers before the wind just after sunrise. Corporal Hayes smelled at first something faint, metallic, almost sweet. Not smoke, not mud. Something unnatural. He stiffened instantly. Masks on. Gas. The warning ripped down the trench like lightning. Men grabbed masks, pulling on rubber, tightening straps with shaking hands. Boots slammed against duckboards as soldiers stumbled into position. Within seconds, a pale yellow cloud began crawling across the battlefield, hugging the ground like a living thing.
Chlorine gas.
The Germans were pushing their advantage after the failed mine. The cloud that ate the light, the gas, moved silently, rolling in waves, swallowing everything it touched. Barbed wire vanished under it. The corpses disappeared. The landscape blurred into greenish fog. Through his mask's fogged lenses, Hayes watched the cloud approach with the slow, deliberate patience of death itself. The first soldiers who didn't get their masks on in time were hit instantly. Their screams echoed from dugouts, horrible, choking cries as lungs filled with acid. Mullen dragged a coughing private towards safety. Breathe. Breathe. Slow. Don't take the mask off. But the young soldier clawed at his throat, foam spilling from his lips. Gas changed men into strangers. The attack behind the cloud, the Germans followed the poison. Shadows emerged behind the gas curtains, rifles raised, bayonets fixed, masks making them look like creatures from nightmares. Dark shapes moved through the haze with inhuman calm. Hayes and his thin line had seconds to respond. "Hold fire until you see them clearly," he shouted, but visibility was only a few meters. Everything beyond that was drowning in green fog. Hayes steadied his rifle. A silhouette formed. Another behind it. Then a dozen. Fire. The trench lit up with muzzle flashes, the only bursts of light in the smothering gloom. German troops dropped, their bodies disappearing into the yellow mist. But still they came. The struggle in the green hell, the Germans hit the parapet hard. Bayonets clashed. Men wrestled, blinded, masks rattling as they fought for breath. Hayes thrust forward, barely seeing his opponent. Blood sprayed against his mask, blurring everything. A German soldier slammed into him, knocking him backward into the mud. They grappled violently, wheezing, slipping, choking until Hayes found his blade and drove it upward. The German slumped, sliding off him. Hayes wiped his mask with a trembling glove. All around him, the trench was chaos, shadows fighting shadows in poison-thick air. When hope arrived on the wind then, suddenly, a gust, just one. A clean, sharp sweep of wind came slicing across the battlefield, tearing at the gas cloud, scattering it into threads. Visibility returned in patches, then in wide gaps. The fog thinned. The yellow retreated. Fresh air rushed into the trench, and men ripped off their masks, gasping like drowning sailors.
German troops, exposed without their gas cover, found themselves caught in open fire.
Machine guns raked them, forcing them into retreat. Within minutes, the attack collapsed. The gas drifted away, leaving only bodies, many British, many German, lying in strange, twisted shapes on the battlefield. Hayes takes the mask off. Hayes sat heavily against a sandbag wall, hands shaking, lungs burning even through the mask's protection. Mullen dropped beside him. "We lived," he whispered, voice raw. Hayes nodded slowly. "Gas doesn't care who wins," he muttered. "It only cares who breathes last." The night the guns went silent, evening fell like a heavy curtain over the ravaged trench line. For the first time in days, the guns stopped. No shells. No machine gun chatter. No distant rumble of artillery. Nothing. Just an eerie, unnatural quiet humming over the battlefield, as if the entire Western Front had paused to catch a single breath. Hayes sat on a broken ammo crate, boots sunk deep in mud, staring at the dying embers of the gas attack. The air still tasted faintly metallic, though the wind had carried the worst of it away. Mullen approached slowly. "Sergeant," he said, voice low, "you should eat something." Hayes didn't look up. "If I eat now, it'll come back up the moment the next bombardment starts." Mullen attempted a weak smile. "Maybe we actually get a quiet night." Hayes exhaled through his nose, a sound almost like a laugh. "Quiet nights don't exist out here. If the guns aren't firing, something else is wrong." He was right. He could feel it. Something was coming. The man who didn't make it, the medics, had laid the casualties in a row behind the trench, covering the gas dead with torn ground sheets. Private Lister, the young man with freckles who always asked Hayes about home, lay among them, turned an unnatural shade of grayish-green. His fingers were curled tight as claws, as if gripping something invisible. Hayes crouched beside him. No matter how long he'd been at the front, it never got easier. He touched the sheet gently.
"I'm sorry, lad."
Mullen stood behind him, cap removed. "He was only 19, he whispered. Hayes nodded slowly. "War doesn't check your age before it takes you." He stood up, straightened his shoulders, and forced the emotion down. There wasn't room for grief in the trenches. Grief was a luxury for safer places. But he felt it. Deep.
And cold.
A visit from command just before dusk. Major Harrington appeared at the fire step, covered in rain and dried mud. He carried a thick map tube and walked with the stiff, angry posture of an officer who had just lost too many men.
Hayes saluted. "Sir."
Harrington returned the salute, eyes heavy. "Sergeant Hayes, I need your section in the dugout.
"There's something we must discuss immediately."
Hayes exchanged a glance with Mullen. Orders after a gas attack usually meant only one thing: a suicidal counterattack. Hayes followed Harrington into the cramped dugout, where a lantern cast sharp shadows across the walls. Several officers stood around a table, a large map pinned down by rifle butts. The major tapped the map. "Intelligence reports a German forward observation post here." He pointed to a small ridge about 300 yards ahead, recently reinforced and disguised. "It's directing artillery onto our supply route." Hayes felt his stomach tighten.
"And you want us to silence it, sir?"
Harrington nodded gravely. "Tonight, before dawn, the artillery will be blind until the guns resume." Mullen muttered under his breath. "So that's why the front is quiet." Hayes understood instantly. The silence wasn't peace. It was preparation. The entire German line was waiting for coordinates from that hidden observation post. If it remained intact, the British front would be obliterated come morning. Hayes straightened.
"What support do we have, sir?"
Harrington looked away for a moment, a bad sign. "None. It's too risky to shell the ridge blindly. Your team must go quietly. A trench raid. At night, across no man's land that still smelled of chlorine. Men rarely returned from those missions. Hayes swallowed the knot in his throat. Understood. Preparing for the dark back in the trench, Hayes gathered his raiding party. Only 8 men, young, exhausted, still shaking from the gas. He addressed them plainly. The ridge ahead has an observation post the Germans just set up. If we don't knock it out tonight, they'll rain hell on our boys by sunrise. The group exchanged tense glances. Private Dalton asked softly, "Just us, Sergeant? No flanking units?" Hayes shook his head. "Just us. We go light. No packs. Bayonets only if we can help it. Silence is our ally." Mullen handed out wire cutters. "No rifles firing unless absolutely necessary." Hayes nodded. "Remember, the moon is behind cloud and the fog gives us cover. But if you get separated, stay low and move toward the ridge. Don't freeze. Don't shout." He paused. "And if you're hit, keep moving until you physically cannot." The men listened without complaint.
Orders were orders.
But Hayes saw the truth in their eyes. They didn't expect all of them to return. The walk into blackness at midnight. They climbed over the parapet. No flares. No gunfire. Only the wet, sucking mud of no man's land and the faint whisper of wind. They moved in single file, crouched low, the world reduced to shadows and heartbeats. The stench of gas still lingered in pockets, places where the wind hadn't yet reached.
Every breath tasted foul.
Barbed wire loomed before them, twisted like skeletal hands. Hayes knelt and began cutting, careful to avoid making noise. Snip, snip.
Slow.
Steady. Once through, the ground sloped upward toward the ridge. A faint dim light glowed atop it, a lantern inside the German post. Hayes signaled a halt. Mullen leaned close. 2 sentries visible. Maybe more inside. Hayes whispered back, "We take the sentries silently. When they're down, we rush the post." His men nodded. Hayes drew his knife, heart pounding softly in his ears. He crawled forward.
10 yards. Cow. 3.
A German sentry turned slightly, mask hanging from his belt, unaware of the shadow approaching him. Hayes rose from the ground in absolute silence, and the sentry suddenly stiffened, eyes widening. He had heard something. Hayes froze. The German opened his mouth to call out, and a shot crackled across the ridge. A rifle. British. Behind them. Hayes whipped around, but in the darkness he saw only a silhouette retreating into fog.
A saboteur.
A traitor? Or someone trying to doom the mission? The German sentry shouted in alarm. "Achtung!" The ridge exploded with gunfire. The raid was blown. Hayes shouted, "Go! Move now!" The quiet night was gone. The dark was alive with bullets, and Hayes had no choice but to charge straight into hell. The ridge of shadows gunfire tore through the night like jagged lightning. Hayes sprinted uphill, boots slipping in wet mud, bullets cracking past his ears. His men followed in scattered bursts, stumbling, diving, climbing as the ridge lit up with muzzle flashes. The German sentries shouted frantic orders. Feuer!
Fire.
Lanterns swung wildly in the observation post, throwing crazed patches of light across the broken slope. The once quiet ridge had erupted into a storm of violence. Hayes felt the old familiar heat of battle rising, that mixture of fear and focus that sharpened the world into clear shapes. But one thought cut through everything. Someone from his side fired that shot. Someone who wanted this mission to fail. He had no time to think about it. Not now. The charge upward. Mullen crashed into the ground beside him, rolling behind a mound of earth. "They're bringing up a machine gun," he shouted. Hayes peeked over the ridge edge. A Maxim gun crew scrambled to set up their weapon on a flat patch near the observation bunker. If they got that thing running, Hayes's team would be mowed down before they even reached the crest. Hayes swore under his breath. Dalton, Fraser, on that gun team flank, left, crawl low. Don't stop until you're breathing down their necks. Dalton nodded, eyes wide but determined. He dragged Fraser along with him, disappearing into darkness. Hayes and Mullen turned toward the sentries. "We take the bunker door." Fast and loud, they sprinted upward again. Bullets hammered the ground around them. Dirt burst in angry plumes.
Hayes felt the heat of a near-miss graze his sleeve.
A German rifleman appeared on the ridge lip. Hayes tackled him hard, knocking the wind from his lungs. They rolled violently, kicking up mud, hands clawing for weapons.
The German reached for his bayonet.
Hayes slammed an elbow into his jaw, the crack loud even through the chaos, and drove his knife downward. The man convulsed and went still.
Hayes caught his breath.
"Up!" he barked to himself. "Moo!" When the Maxim screamed, Dalton and Fraser were halfway to the machine gun when the Maxim roared to life. A stream of glowing tracers tore through the slope, slicing the darkness, ripping chunks of earth into the air. Fraser dove behind a broken tree stump. Dalton wasn't quick enough. The hail of bullets caught him mid-sprint. His body jerked unnaturally, spinning as he fell. He slid down the ridge, motionless, his helmet rolling beside him. Mullen shouted, "Dalton!" Hayes grabbed him.
Keep moving!
"We reach the post or none of this means anything." Mullen clenched his jaw, eyes red but focused. He nodded once and followed Hayes toward the bunker. The door of death, the entrance to the German observation post, was a timber frame reinforced with sandbags. A lantern inside flickered, silhouettes moving rapidly behind it. Hayes stopped just short of the doorway. "On 3, he whispered.
1, 2.
A rifle barrel thrust out of the doorway. Mullen reacted first. He knocked the rifle aside as the German fired. The shot slammed into the doorframe inches from Hayes's face. Hayes charged straight into the entrance. Inside the bunker, the interior was cramped, thick with cigarette smoke and sweat. 4 German soldiers stood inside, surprised, scrambling for rifles and pistols. Hayes didn't hesitate. His rifle butt smashed into the nearest man's face. Mullen tackled another across the table, knocking maps and compasses flying. A 3rd German fired wildly, the muzzle flash blinding in the small space. The bullet tore into the ceiling, showering everyone with splinters. Hayes lunged, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted hard. The pistol dropped. Hayes struck him twice, once to disarm, once to finish the fight. The 4th soldier raised his hands in surrender, shouting, "Nicht schießen!" "Bit!" Hayes shoved him aside, breathing hard. "Clear," Mullen gasped. "We have the post." But Hayes wasn't celebrating. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. The maps on the table. Hayes turned toward the table where the Germans had been working. Spread across it were detailed sketches of the British front-line trenches, supply routes, ammo dumps. But one thing froze him cold. Among the German papers lay a single British-issued notebook. Small, dark, stamped with a faded regimental crest. Mullen saw it too. How the hell did they get that? Hayes flipped it open. The handwriting inside was unmistakably English. Coordinates, artillery timings, communication codes, information no German scout could have gathered alone. Mullen stared. This is insider intel. Hayes, somebody from our side is feeding them. Hayes's blood ran colder than the night air. A traitor, he whispered. The shot that sabotaged the raid. The silence before the gas. The perfectly timed German assaults. It all connected. Too perfectly. Someone didn't want us stopping this observation post, Hayes murmured. Someone close. Mullen swallowed. But why? Who the hell would? Before he could finish, a grenade rolled into the doorway.
A small metal cylinder.
Hissing, smoking. Hayes's eyes widened. Down! He grabbed Mullen and threw him behind the table as the grenade detonated with a deafening blast. Splinters, dirt, and fragments of timber filled the air. The entire front wall of the observation post collapsed inward, and standing outside, framed by drifting smoke, was a lone silhouette carrying a British rifle. Not German.
British.
The traitor. The man who had fired the shot that doomed the raid. He turned and ran into the darkness before Hayes could rise. Hayes staggered to his feet, coughing, vision blurred.
"Sergeant,"
Mullen rasped. "Was that?" Hayes didn't answer. He couldn't, but he recognized the build.
"The stride."
The way the silhouette held the rifle. A British uniform. A familiar one. A man Hayes knew. He stared into the night, breath trembling. "God help us," he whispered. "It's one of our own." The traitor in the smoke, the ridge was coming apart. The grenade blast had torn half the observation post open, and the remaining support beams groaned under their own weight. Dirt sifted down like dark snow. Lanterns flickered wildly, casting trembling shadows across the wreckage. Hayes coughed hard, forcing air back into his bruised lungs. Mullen staggered upright beside him. "Sergeant, we have to go. Germans will swarm this place any moment." Hayes nodded, vision still blurred from the blast. But one image was burned into his mind. A British soldier, running from the bunker. The same silhouette who fired the shot that exposed the raid. The traitor. Hayes pushed the thought aside they had seconds before the Germans counterattacked. "Grab the notebook," Hayes said sharply.
"We're not leaving that behind."
Mullen snatched the British intelligence book off the shattered table, stuffing it into his tunic. Hayes checked his rifle, dented, but usable. "Right," he said, steadying himself. "Move." Escape from the ridge, they slipped out through the blown-open wall, stepping over broken planks and scattered German gear. Night air hit them like a slap, cold, biting, filled with drifting smoke from the explosion. Shouts rose from the base of the ridge. "Achtung! Auf den Hügel! Schnell! Schnell!" Dozens of German soldiers were rushing up the slope. Hayes grabbed Mullen's shoulder. "Don't run straight, zigzag. They've got rifles." The two men scrambled across the uneven ground, staying low, hearts pounding. Rifle cracks echoed behind them, flashes of light in the dark. Bullets clipped soil inches from their boots. One whistled past Hayes's ear, so close he felt the air shimmer. They slid down the far side of the ridge in a controlled fall, boots kicking up mud. The ground leveled out at the bottom, but the danger didn't. A flare shot into the sky, bathing no man's land in harsh white light. Everything became visible. Every crater. Every body. Every running man. Mullen cursed. "They're lighting us up." Hayes grabbed his arm and pulled him behind a shattered tree trunk.
"Stay still."
They're scanning for movement. German rifles swept the field, looking for silhouettes. Hayes's breath felt painfully loud in his ears.
The flare fizzled, then went out.
Darkness returned. "Now," Hayes whispered. "Go." They moved again quietly, quickly, toward the British trench line, still faintly glowing under distant lanterns. The body in the crater halfway across the field, Mullen froze. Hayes turned. "What?" Mullen pointed shakily into a deep shell crater. There, half buried in mud, lay a British soldier. But not any soldier. The man's uniform matched their own battalion. Hayes slid down into the crater, heart hammering. He rolled the body slightly, and his breath caught. Sergeant Willis, his own second in command. But Willis had been on sentry duty at the rear line. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this raid.
Hayes checked his pockets.
Empty. Willis's rifle was missing. His map case gone. His ID discs torn off. Mullen whispered, "Hayes, you don't think?" Hayes stared at the corpse's boots. The same type, same wear pattern, same size as the man who fled the bunker. But something was wrong.
Very wrong.
Hayes leaned closer. Willis had been dead for hours. Blood dried at the mouth. Mud crusted on the uniform. His body stiff. He didn't fire that shot. He didn't flee the bunker. He had been posed here, placed by someone who wanted Hayes to find him. Hayes's stomach dropped. "Mullen, the traitor wants us confused. Wants us suspecting our own." Mullen swallowed. "If it wasn't Willis, then who the hell?" Hayes closed the dead sergeant's eyes gently. We need to move. Now. The sprint to the line as they climbed out of the crater. More German shouts carried through the wind. A machine gun opened up behind them, tracers slicing through the night. Hayes and Mullen sprinted across the last stretch of no man's land, ducking and weaving as bullets tore up earth around their feet. The British trench loomed ahead, dark figures waving them in. "Come on, run!" Hayes leaped over the parapet, landing hard on his knees. Mullen stumbled in behind him. Riflemen fired over their heads, forcing the Germans to pull back. The trench fell into frantic motion, medics rushing in, officers yelling orders. A lieutenant stormed over.
"Sergeant Hayes, what happened out there? Where's Dalton?"
"Fraser? The rest?" Hayes removed his helmet slowly. "Dalton is gone. Fraser, I don't know. The ridge is crawling with Germans." The lieutenant exhaled sharply. "The major is waiting for your report. Now." The notebook's dark secret. Hayes and Mullen entered the dugout, where Major Harrington stood over a lamplit desk.
Hayes saluted. "Sir, the ridge is destroyed. The observation post is neutralized." Harrington nodded.
"Good. And the casualties?"
Hayes hesitated.
"Hi, sir."
Mullen spoke next, placing the British notebook on the table. The major froze.
"Where did you get this?"
Hayes answered quietly. "Inside the German observation post." Harrington opened it and his face drained of color. This is artillery timing for this sector. Updated, accurate, and written by a British hand." Mullen added, "We believe a traitor is operating among our ranks, sir." Harrington's jaw tightened.
"Who?"
Hayes stared into the lamplight.
"We don't know."
"But he sabotaged the raid tonight, fired a shot to expose us, then tried to kill us with a grenade."
Harrington paced, breathing fast.
"This cannot spread. If the men suspect there's a traitor, discipline will collapse." Hayes stepped forward.
"Sir, we need to track him down."
Quietly. The major stopped pacing.
"Sergeant Hayes, find him."
Hayes nodded once.
"Yes, sir."
The name Mullen feared as they exited the dugout. Mullen fell into step beside him. "So where do we start?" Hayes answered without looking at him, by figuring out who had access to artillery schedules. Mullen thought for a moment. Officers, runners, forward observers. Maybe he stopped mid-sentence. Hayes turned slowly.
Say it.
Mullen swallowed hard.
Maybe
Corporal Reeves. Hayes felt a coldness spread through his chest. Reeves, their communications runner? Quiet, sharp, trusted. Too trusted. He knew trench maps. He delivered artillery updates. He always moved between posts freely. And earlier that night, he had been missing from his usual station. Hayes whispered, "If Reeves is the mole, then we're already in deeper danger than I thought." Mullen stared into the night sky.
"He could be anywhere."
Hayes shook his head.
"No."
"He'll be close. Traitors hide best in places that look safe." He tightened his grip on his rifle. "And I'm going to find him." The whispering wires night had settled over room 40 like a velvet curtain. The only light came from shaded lamps, falling in soft halos over stacks of intercepted telegrams. The air hummed with pencil scratches, rustling paper, and the quiet tension of minds racing faster than machines. Nigel de Grey leaned forward, staring at the cracked German cipher before him. His tea had gone cold hours ago. His eyes burned. But something in this message was different, a pattern he had seen before and feared. A faint click echoed as the door opened. Dilwyn Knox stepped in, coat still damp from the London rain. "Still at it?" Knox asked, rubbing his hands before hovering over de Grey's shoulder. "Your face says this telegram isn't routine." "It isn't," Nigel replied. "Look here, these groupings, they match the structure from Berlin's diplomatic channel, high level." He tapped the coded text, a string of meaningless letters. But to them, it was a locked door, waiting for a key. Knox frowned. "Another negotiation update? Or troop movement?" "I don't think so," Nigel whispered.
This feels like strategy. Something large. Something they're hiding even from their allies. Before Knox could respond, the room's heavy air was broken by Admiral Hall's entrance, the bulldog of British intelligence, coat perfectly pressed, eyes sharp with authority. "Gentlemen," Hall said, shutting the door behind him with a soft but commanding click, "we have another intercept. Mexico. Germany's embassy, and I want it cracked tonight." He placed a second sheet on the table. Similar code groups. Similar structure. Nigel felt his pulse pick up. Germany. Mexico. Berlin's diplomatic channel. He looked at Knox, who had turned pale. "Tell me you see it too," Nigel whispered. Knox swallowed. "It's the same cipher family as the one sitting on your desk." Admiral Hall observed their faces, then folded his arms. "Whatever this telegram contains, gentlemen, it is going to matter greatly." De Grey ran his fingers over the message, the way a pianist feels the keys before striking the first note. "I'm not certain yet," he said softly, "but I think Germany is planning something outside Europe, something risky." Knox took the message, tilting it under the lamp. "And they don't want anyone in the Central Powers to know." A sudden gust rattled the window panes. London seemed to hold its breath. Admiral Hall's voice dropped to a level that felt almost prophetic. "Break their code," he said. "Find their secret. Because I fear this isn't just about war on the seas or in the trenches." He paused. "This may pull another nation into the fire." The three men locked eyes. Something vast was taking shape in the shadows, and they were the only ones who could reveal it. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Inside room 40, a different kind of storm began to form, one made of numbers, letters, secrets, and the fate of nations.